is for the grave they'll dig for you. Oh, I'll get you in one shot or two. R is really, really extra bloody gory. E is even more than anyone that you can shoot can. Gore is all I'm here to bring to you. Gore is everything I'm here to do. Do some violence and break your heart in silence. Gore's the gift I give to you.
Well, that was stupid. Hey everyone, it's Mox, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be reviewing Gungrave G.O.R.E, a game that's about 18 years in the making. Not that it's been in development for 18 years, just that it's been a long time coming. Now, I'm just laying out some completely unedited gameplay here of the first level, so there will be no spoilery footage, unless stated otherwise, and to spare you all from having to look at my face. Now, for transparency, I did begin writing this review script before I finished the campaign, and I've just added and edited as necessary as my thoughts and feelings either changed or were reinforced throughout the playthrough. With that out of the way, let's start from the very beginning. For those unfamiliar with the franchise, and yes, it is a franchise, Gungrave started on the PlayStation 2 back in 2002, developed and published by Red Entertainment, with character designs by Trigun mangaka, and I might slaughter this name, Yasuhiro Naito. It was received well enough to get a 2004 sequel called Gungrave Overdose, developed by AcoustiClub and still published by Red, and it even got a VR revival in 2017. There was also that 2003 anime adaptation by Madhouse that dragged so incredibly badly, but that's perhaps a story for another day. This video is about the games. The games that were never the most complex, not even for their time. The setup is incredibly simple. You play as Beyond the Grave, formerly known as Brandon Heat, who was betrayed and killed by his ex-best friend Harry McDowell to climb up the ranks of the Millennium crime family. And then, through some video game science by a doctor named Tokioka, Brandon is brought back to life as an unspeaking, dual-wielding, gun-slinging badass, lugging around a gigantic but weirdly still not big enough to fit him coffin-like gun, cannon, saw thing called the Death Hauler. And the gameplay, you shoot things. That's pretty much it. You shoot things. With very little variety. Well, you can swing around your coffin for melee and to deflect rockets at times, but that's about it. My history with this franchise goes back a while, since I played the originals on the PS2 when I bought a dual pack with it in the sequel. I managed to finish it back then, and then again about a year or so ago, but I never managed to get around to the sequel in its entirety, but from what I played of Overdose, it was more of the same. As games, they're very straightforward and pretty satisfying. You're a gun-toting zombie man thing, and you slaughter bad guys. The story in these games aren't the best written narratives you'll find out there, but if you want to catch up on what happened before jumping into this latest one, the main menu does offer a short History of Gungrave video that you can watch, which weirdly doesn't feature any sort of voiceover. As for the gameplay, it was very fun. If a little mindless, it was the style of the time, especially for these lower-budget AA style games. But that was the early 2000s. It's 2022. Games have changed, and gamers have changed, and tastes have changed, and amidst all of that, Gungrave G.O.R.E, developed by Studio Igimob, a Korean studio that was also responsible for the VR entry, and published by Prime Matter, known for publishing games like Wasteland 3 and Kingdom Come Deliverance. Taking place after the event of Overdose, G.O.R.E sees Grave working with a now adult Mika, the girl from the first two games, and her group, and again I'm going to slaughter this, the El Canal, to take down the Raven Clan. Full disclosure, I didn't really understand what was happening narratively for the most part of my playthrough, but it doesn't really matter, does it? We're here to shoot things, and shoot things we do. Gungrave G.O.R.E plays exactly like its PS2 predecessors, for better and for worse. The shoot button has been moved to the right trigger as opposed to the square button, I believe, on the originals, but other than that, it's pretty much the same. The game automatically aims at enemies so you can focus on shooting things, swinging your coffin at things, and making things blow up with your coffin using a demolition shot, which are special attacks that we'll discuss more later, but pretty much, it's literally that straightforward. But those are the things that Gore has in common with the originals. Like I mentioned earlier, it's 2022. 20 years from when the franchise was born, and games, gamers, and tastes in games have changed. So does Gore do anything to at least resemble something from the modern day, aside from graphics? Honestly, no. But I don't mean that to necessarily be a bad thing. It can be, but not necessarily. On top of the old school gameplay that is completely faithful to the originals, the game has a Devil May Cry style upgrade system that increases your health, your shield regen, you can add new demolition point slots, you can get new demolition shots, and new melee combos with a coffin that give the game a bit more of a spectacle fighter / character action feel, but not quite to any extent that would actually resemble a Devil May Cry or a Bayonetta. Like I said, it's an upgrade system taken from more modern concepts, but not necessarily new either. After all, the original Devil May Cry came out a year before the original Gungrave. Beyond that, those melee combos are usually just there to help you deal with enemies that carry shields, because the alternative shield breaker would be having to charge a shot with your pistols by holding down the right trigger, which takes just a little too long to be practical. But speaking of enemies, you will be swarmed with enemies. That is literally the point, not just of this game, but of the franchise as a whole. At any given moment, you could be in a firefight against up to 10 or 20 enemies at once, and you have to deal with balancing shooting the ones you can, deflecting rockets if there are any, breaking enemy shields, mitigating your own shield damage with dodging so your health doesn't take a hit, and it's a lot. To help you do this, Gore does introduce mechanics like the ability to grab an enemy and use it as a human shield, which gives your own shield time to regen to help with tighter spots. It even introduces a Doom-style glory kill / execution called RIPs that regenerate your shield. On the topic of these executions though, enemies have to be stunned to do it, but it was never really clear what you needed to do to get enemies to that vulnerable state. Most of the time enemies just die, but sometimes in the middle of a firefight there's just going to be a guy or 2 or 3 that's suddenly highlighted with a contextual prompt of either L3 if you're near, or R1 if they're far, to do the execution, and depending on the enemy type, R1 either pulls the enemy to you, or you to the enemy. Another thing to help with the combat is the aforementioned demolition shots, which is a returning mechanic. Demolition shots are special moves where you use a button combination, which is L2 plus a face button, and Grave then uses the coffin to shoot rockets or many bullets to help clear out massive groups of enemies, or, even just a single enemy if you want to be over the top. Don't let me tell you what to do. Throughout the playthrough though, you will be able to unlock many different kinds of demolition shots that you can map to different button combinations, but they all serve essentially the same purpose: kill many bad guys quick. I did most of my playthrough with only 2 kinds of demolition shots, and for the most part they were more than sufficient. The last new addition to combat is Fury Mode, where Grave just basically becomes extra strong and immune to knockbacks and staggers for a little bit by using up 1 demolition point, and you can extend its duration through the DMC style upgrade menu. Fury Mode is a little understated in the game, but it's proven itself to be quite useful when you're surrounded by many enemies who are able to interrupt your attacks. The game expects you to utilize the auto-aim, the charge shots, the coffin melee, the glory kills, the human shield, the dodging, Fury Mode, demolition shots, all of these mechanics and more to be as effective as you can in combat, because to further the spectacle fighter comparison, or rather, the game's desire for a spectacle fighter comparison, the game grades you at the end of each level, and honestly, I don't really know why, nor do I care for it. Because again, the game doesn't come off as a spectacle fighter. In Gungrave Overdose, you were able to unlock secondary characters with different movesets like Bunji Kugashira for a replay, but in Gore, Bunji is overwoven into the main campaign's playthrough, where you're locked to playing as him in certain levels. The same is true for a melee-based character named Quartz, kinda like Devil May Cry 4 and 5's multiple character campaign. Gungrave Gore wants to be in the character action / spectacle fighter conversation, but I just don't think it belongs there because it is its own unique beast. So, I have laid out the game. Hell, I've laid out the entire franchise. We've established that story is a far second in terms of significance and that the gameplay is king here. So, after sitting through probably about 8-9 minutes of me explaining everything, hopefully you're curious by now for me to get to my point. What do I think of it? And well, it's Gungrave. And I know that sounds anticlimactic, but as a fan of Gungrave, that's sorta all I really need it to be. More. And, easily accessible on modern hardware legitimately. It feels familiar, it looks familiar, just prettier and in HD, and to me, that's kind of enough. However, if you've never heard of this franchise before and you're seeing this latest entry on shelves at your local game store, or your digital storefront on PlayStation, Xbox, PC, or even seeing it completely free and ready to play on Game Pass, which is how I played it, this might not be the game for you if you're a person with very modern gaming sensibilities, which, for the record, is completely fine, by the way. Modern games have so much quality of life and accessibility additions that sometimes it's just really difficult for some people to go back to before those features were present. This game is chock full of PS2 era jank and game design, which, as a franchise fan, I believe is part of its charm, but obviously, that may not appeal to everyone. The game desperately lacks a modern polish. Don't get me wrong, it's a fairly polished game. It looks pretty enough, it runs well enough, and I didn't get any major bugs that broke the game. It's just not a modern game. It's very much a callback to where and when it came from. But if you're willing to turn the clock back a little bit and experience it with an open mind, there is fun to be had with Gungrave G.O.R.E. But that was me sprinkling in subjective forgiveness, because I'm a fan. But dear God, as much as I'm enjoying this old school feel, there are still certain things about it that are preventing me from being able to fully recommend the game. There's one big one in terms of game design that I will get into later, but before that, let's go through a little nitpick speed round. Number 1. Voice acting is not at all good, but this sorta gets a pass since story barely matters anyway. There was an attempt to give weight to that narrative later on, but the shooting is what we're here for. No offense to the cast, I'm sure they did their best, but it just fell short for me. Highlights for the performances were Quartz, Bungie, and one of the bosses, Big Wu Shen. Number 2, still on voices, a lot of combat scenarios involved with an enemy shouting holy shit, and it gets annoying really quickly. Number 3, the character Quartz that I mentioned earlier talks to Grave non-stop through comms, and her dialogue is bad and repetitive and very unnecessary in those comms. I checked and you can turn this off, but it shouldn't have been there to begin with. Number 4, this is specific to PC, but optimization is subpar. I read somewhere that the game has major shader compilation issues that make the early levels run with heavy stutters, and that's pretty accurate to my experience, nothing game-breaking though. Number 5, cutscenes are pre-rendered and locked to 30 FPS. That's nothing major, but there you go. Number 6, level design is deceptively/unnecessarily open. The game doesn't feature collectibles or even pickups of any sort, but a lot of levels, if not most levels, have side areas or rooms that are fully explorable with nothing in them. They add nothing to the experience and can sometimes even be distracting from moving forward through the level, which does affect your end of level grade because yes, speed is one of the things the game grades you for. Number 7, too many explodable things. An already busy combat scenario can get even busier and visually noisier with too many unnecessary explosions around you that yes, damages and even kills enemies, but they were gonna die anyway. Thankfully, this didn't affect performance in my experience at least. Number 8, a level each for Bungie and Quartz inserted into the main campaign feels tacked on just so players can experience their gameplay. Proof of this is that when their respective levels start, you immediately get a multi-page tutorial prompt that explains every single aspect of their gameplay before you can even move them. Number 9. Quartz's melee-focused gameplay is really good and actually a really good change of pace for the main campaign. However, her level design involves instant death pits over platforming areas, which I know doesn't seem too bad, but I have plenty to say about instant death areas later. Number 10. Lastly, the game really likes spawning enemies behind you, which, for an extremely linear game where your main goal is to go forward, can get incredibly annoying, especially since G.O.R.E removed the 180 quick turn button from the originals. The next one is a big one, so we're leaving the nitpick speed round. Certain enemy types that are intended to add challenge to the game end up being more frustrating than anything else. There are two that specifically come to mind, which are the shield guys and the green smoke guys that are incredibly annoying because they bring the fast-paced shooting gameplay to a screeching halt. Shield guys, as I mentioned earlier, require a charge shot to take down, or melee with a coffin. They're fine in small numbers, maybe 1 or 2, but there are instances where the game drops 5 or so of them at once and you can't get your charge shots in fast enough, or you can't complete your melee combo fast enough because there's about 15 other guys shooting at you with either rockets or shotguns that knock you back, and boy oh boy, we'll get to knock back later too. The green smoke guys, on the other hand, just throw canisters of green smoke at you, and that smoke fills a small AoE that cancels the auto-aim when Grave's in it, and for a game whose core mechanic relies on that auto-aim, manual aim isn't so much of an additional challenge, it just ruins the pacing. For other third-person games, manually aiming is obviously part of the experience, but Gungrave has always prioritized arcadey, chaotic gunplay that's aided perfectly by that auto-aim, not to mention its narrative significance that Grave is just that damn good of a shot. And the removal of that core mechanic feels like an artificial bump in difficulty rather than just giving us smarter enemies. But I can live with the manual aiming, especially since that's not even anywhere near as bad as the fact that the green smoke also fills up so much of the screen that it makes it hard to see what you're being forced to manually aim at, adding to the visual noise that I mentioned earlier. But moving on to my final point of criticism, which is the PS2 era jankiness. I know, I mentioned earlier that it was part of the game's charm, which it arguably is. But it also comes with gameplay and general design decisions that were best left in times past. There is nothing worse than having your gameplay interrupted for no reason, and modern games have mostly perfected their approach in addressing that. Games like Dark Souls or Elden Ring, where you die a lot, make the whole respawn process efficient enough that dying, while still a little annoying, doesn't really feel intrusive to your gameplay. Further than that, games like Hotline Miami or Katana Zero are even better at it in that you would have already respawned before you even realized what killed you. And in a bit, I will get into why those are the examples I'm using, but for now, still on the topic of gameplay interruption, allow me to show you the unedited opening moments of the game's 5th level. If you're wondering what you just saw, let me break it down. The level starts, about 30-ish seconds of gameplay, and boom, a cutscene. A cutscene that didn't need to be a cutscene. A cutscene that could have just been playable. This entire level highlights the game's worst traits. Traits that are products of the game's desire to be as faithful to its 6th generation roots as possible. After that cutscene, the gameplay moves to the top of the moving train, and on top of this train, the game has 2 major issues designed as challenges. 1, you can fall off the side to the train, and 2, you're racing against an invisible clock to get to a point in front of the train where you can drop down before the train goes inside of a tunnel, and you die. Remember how I said I was going to discuss knockbacks and respawns and instant deaths? Well, here it is. Because while the roof segment at the start of the level was perfectly manageable once you learn and understand what's happening, it isn't the only one. The second roof segment comes at the very end of the train level, and sure, we can say that this is where the challenge ramps up because it's the level's closing moments, but a swarm of enemies that are capable of major knockback with rockets, shotguns, exploding landmines that can toss you off the train, which is an instant death by the way, on top of having to once again race after an invisible clock to get to a drop point before a tunnel, and an additional platforming challenge of having to dodge road signs and jumping over beams that deal major damage if you hit them, this is not a gameplay challenge. This is a challenge of attrition. A challenge of trial and error. You can't ignore enemies and rush to the drop point. They will knock you off the train. You can't take your time with fighting everyone. You will run out of time. This segment is repeated trial and error to figure out the best course of action at every step of the way until you manage to get through it. And each mistake, like I said, is an instant death, and each instant death is a redo. And each redo is a death screen followed by a do you want to continue prompt, followed by a few seconds of your character posing after selecting yes, and only then followed by a load screen which totals to around 30 seconds before being able to respawn, which, by the way, also wastes a few extra seconds with a level start kick their ass prompt. You don't believe me? Let's watch this clip of an intentional death I did so we can count how long it actually is. This is a major gameplay interruption, and I'm sorry if my modern gamer tastes find this goddamn unacceptable. These gameplay, interface, and level design decisions are remnants of a more experimental PS2 era. Not to mention artificial difficulty to pad the runtime. Now, I'm not saying you shouldn't be able to fall off the side of the train. Genuinely, that can be a pretty good challenge if used correctly. And now, I'm not saying either that there shouldn't be a clock to race against. A ticking clock adds tension. But the decision to have this entire segment be trial and error between fighting and running and platforming, meanwhile not allowing for a quicker respawn to accommodate repeated attempts because it's emulating how respawning was back in the day, is a waste of so much goddamn time for literally zero gain. The train level is genuinely one big hurdle for me when it comes to considering a replay down the line. And it could be a hurdle that inhibits people who are just jumping into Gungrave for the first time to see the rest of what the game has to offer. It's a shame, because if players can get used to the old school gameplay, there's a really fun game here. Unfortunately, it somehow manages to showcase its worst sides at the same time in the same level, and it may be too difficult to look past. I love this franchise. I always have, and I was beyond excited to find out that we were getting a third game. And I genuinely enjoyed about 80% of what the game had to offer. But while the nostalgic vibe is more than enough to put Gore generally in my good graces, I can't ignore the fact that it's a product of its time, and its time was 20 years ago. Ultimately, I think what Studio Iggy Mob gave us here is the foundations for what could be a potentially bright future, and they're pretty solid foundations too. If the franchise continues and it's willing to let go of some of the past and embrace some of the present to bring us the best of both, then, much like Brandon Heat, it could come back from the dead and do more than survive in today's gaming landscape. It could thrive. So that's Gungrave G.O.R.E. In a nutshell, it brings you the best and the worst of nostalgic gaming. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. What other topic do you want me to cover? Comment below for your suggestions, and let me know what you think of the game. Did you like it? Did you hate it? Did you get past level 5? Click the notification bell to be notified when I upload new videos. Next week is going to be about Evil West. Should be exciting. This has been MajorasMox, reminding you to be excellent to each other, and I'll see you next time. I know you can't see my face, but I definitely winked there. Bye-bye.